The man at the end of the bar was told to stand, not asked to wait, not told the seats were reserved. Told to stand, the way you tell a thing where it belongs, and the bartender said it, without looking up from the glass he was polishing. The way a man delivers a verdict he believes is too obvious to require his eyes. His name was Elias Brandt. He was 51 years old, and he had walked into the Meridian Room on a Thursday evening in a Chuck Hall coat that had cost more than the bartender's monthly rent, though nobody in that room could have known it, because nothing about the way Elias carried himself announced a price. He had asked for a single seat at the long marble bar. One seat. There were 4 of them empty. The bartender's name was Conrad. He was 34, lean, with the kind of practiced ease that elite hospitality drills into a person until courtesy becomes a weapon they can aim. He looked at Elias, and then he looked at the 4 empty stools, and then he said the seats were being held and that the gentleman might be more comfortable somewhere else. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not move toward the stools. He set one hand flat on the cool marble and let it rest there, and he asked, very quietly, whether the seats were reserved for someone arriving, or simply reserved against him. What happened next is the reason I am telling you this. 20 minutes later, the owner of the Meridian Room crossed that floor, stopped beside Elias, put a hand on his shoulder in front of the entire room, and called him the 2 words that drained every drop of colour from Conrad's face. Before we get to what the owner said, though, you need to understand who Elias was and why a single empty stool in a marble bar carried the weight of 40 years, and why the most dangerous thing in that room was not the man being refused a seat, but everything he had already survived to be standing there at all. Let me take you back. Elias was raised in a row house on the east side of a steel city that has since forgotten it was ever a steel city. His mother worked nights cleaning the offices of men who would not have recognized her face in daylight. His grandmother, a woman named Ada Brandt, raised him in the hours between. And Ada is where this story truly begins, because everything Elias became, he became with her hands on his shoulders first. Ada had been born in a county where the schools for children like her closed early and opened late, and taught little in between. She had taught herself to read from a Bible and a seed catalogue and the backs of medicine bottles, and she had carried into her old age a fury about knowledge that she never once raised her voice to express. She believed that a mind was the one piece of property the world could not take back. She told her grandson this so many times it stopped being a sentence and became a kind of weather he lived inside. She gave him one object when he was 9 years old. It was a brass pocket watch, dented on the back, the crystal scratched soft from decades of pockets. It did not keep good time. It ran 4 minutes slow and always had. Ada told him the watch had belonged to her own father, a man who had worked the rail yards and had never once been late to a shift in 40 years, because he had learned the watch ran slow and built his entire life around arriving before the world expected him. She pressed it into the boy's palm and closed his fingers over it. Be early, she told him. Be early to everything, because they will always say you came too late. Elias carried that watch for 42 years. He carried it the night he stood at the marble bar in the Meridian Room. It was in the inside pocket of the charcoal coat, 4 minutes slow, ticking against his chest. Here is what you need to understand about the gap between what a room sees and what a room misses. When Elias was 11, the city built a new library 3 bus transfers from his house, a gleaming thing of glass and limestone meant for a neighborhood that was not his. He went anyway. He took the 3 buses every Saturday for 6 years. The librarian there, an old man with ink-stained cuffs, noticed the boy who arrived at opening and left at closing, and one winter he began setting aside books he thought the boy should have. Not the books on the assigned lists, the hard ones. The ones about how money moved, how cities were built, how the invisible architecture underneath a society decided who got a seat and who was told to stand. By the time Elias was 17, he understood more about the mechanics of capital than most men twice his age who wore suits to discuss it. He had no degree. He had no name anyone knew. He had a library card worn soft at the corners and a grandmother who checked his understanding at the kitchen table every night. asking him to explain back to her what he had read, refusing to let him pass off a sentence he did not truly grasp. She died the spring he turned 18. She died in the back bedroom of the row house with his hand in hers. And the last thing she did was reach for the watch in his pocket and tap it twice with one finger. Early, she said. That was the whole of it. Then she was gone, and Elias was 18 years old with a brass watch that ran slow and a head full of knowledge nobody had given him permission to have. He did not go to college. There was no money for it, and by the time there could have been, he had already begun building the thing that would consume the next 3 decades of his life in total silence. He started with a single rental property, a collapsing duplex 2 streets from where he was born, bought with money he had saved, working dawn shifts at a loading dock and reading ledgers at night. He repaired it himself. He learned plumbing from a book and wiring from a man at the dock who owed him a favour. He rented both halves to families who needed somewhere clean and fair, and he charged them less than he could have, because Ada had taught him that the fast way to lose your soul was to bleed the people closest to your own beginning. 1 duplex became 2. 2 became a block. Elias understood something the credentialed men around him did not, which was that the neighbourhoods everyone else had written off were not worthless. They were mispriced. He was not buying ruins. He was buying the gap between what a place was worth and what the world had decided it was worth, and that gap, compounded across 30 years and several hundred buildings, made Elias quietly, enormously, invisibly wealthy. He never announced it. He wore old coats until they fell apart, and then he bought good ones and wore those until they fell apart too. He drove a sedan with 200,000 miles on it. He gave away more in a year than most of the men at the Meridian Room earned. And he gave it through a foundation that bore his grandmother's name and not his own, funding libraries in the kind of neighbourhoods that 3 buses away had once saved his life. The elegance of his mind, the plainness of his coat, that gap is the whole of this story. Now let me tell you about the man who owned the bar where Elias was told to stand. His name was Thomas Reyes, and 40 years earlier he had been a skinny kid who took the same 3 buses to the same gleaming library, sat at the same long table, and one Saturday looked up to find a boy his own age sliding a book across the wood toward him, open to a page about how compound interest worked, saying only, "You should read this part twice, it changes everything." That boy was Elias. Thomas never forgot it. They had grown up 2 miles and a world apart, and the library had been the one place their lives overlapped, and over the years that overlap had become the deepest friendship either man would ever have. Thomas had gone into restaurants, had clawed his way up from dish pits to ownership, had built the Meridian Room into the most exclusive dining room in the city. Elias had built his quiet empire of buildings. They met for breakfast every second Sunday. They had done so for 31 years. Thomas did not know Elias was coming that Thursday night. Elias had not told him. He had come alone on impulse, to sit at the bar of his oldest friend's finest room and have a single drink in honor of a date that mattered only to him. It was the anniversary of Ada's death. He came every year, somewhere quiet, and raised a glass, and tapped the watch twice the way she had tapped it last. He had never been to the Meridian Room as a guest before. He had always come through the kitchen on Sundays when Thomas was there. He had never tested what the front of the room would make of a black man in a plain coat who walked in alone and asked for a seat. Now he knew. Let me bring you back to the marble bar, because the refusal did not end with one sentence. It rarely does. A refusal is a door, and once it opens, smaller cruelties walk through it, one after another, each one testing whether the first one will be allowed to stand. Conrad set down the glass he had been polishing. He told Elias in the lowered, reasonable voice that elite rooms teach their staff to use when they are being least reasonable, that the bar seating was for members and registered guests, and that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding about what kind of establishment this was. He let his eyes move once briefly, down the charcoal coat to the unshined shoes and back up. It was a small gesture. It was meant to be small. The cruelty of a place like the Meridian Room is almost never loud. It is a glance that costs nothing and means everything. Couple 2 stools down had stopped talking. A woman in a green dress watched over the rim of her wine. At the host stand near the entrance, a young woman named Priya had gone very still, a stack of leather menus pressed against her chest, watching the bar with an expression she was working hard to keep off her face. Elias did not argue. Understand that this is not the same as Elias being defeated. He came from a woman who taught him that arguing with a closed door only splinters your own hands. He simply asked Conrad his name, politely, the way you might ask a man you intended to remember, Conrad told him. Elias nodded once and did not write it down, because he did not need to. Then he asked whether the manager was available. Something flickered across Conrad's face. Not fear, not yet. Irritation, the irritation of a man who believed the matter was closed and resented being asked to reopen it. He said the manager was busy. He said it in a way meant to end the conversation. He picked up another glass. Elias took his hand off the marble. He stepped back from the bar, not in retreat, but in the manner of a man giving a situation room to reveal itself, and he moved to a small standing table near the window, and he waited. He took the brass watch out of his coat and held it loosely in his palm, and he looked at the time it told, which was 4 minutes slow, which meant the real hour was later than it appeared, which had been the secret of his whole life. He was always early. The world was always later than it believed. He did not know that Priya, at the host stand, had already set down her menus and slipped through the door to the back hallway. I want to stop here and tell you what the room saw, because it matters. The room saw a man in a plain coat who had been told he did not belong and who had not made a scene about it. Most of the room found this comfortable. A refusal that produces no scene is easy to forget by the second sip of wine. The woman in the green dress had already turned back to her companion. The couple 2 stools down resumed their conversation. The marble bar gleamed. The 4 stools sat empty. This is the thing about being made invisible. The room does not experience it as cruelty. The room experiences it as nothing at all, as the absence of an inconvenience, and that nothing is the most exhausting weight a person can be asked to carry, because there is no edge to push against. There is only the smooth marble and the averted eyes and the 4 empty seats that were somehow, impossibly, all spoken for. Elias had carried that weight his entire life. He had carried it in bank offices where loan officers explained things to him slowly that he understood better than they did. He had carried it at closings where lawyers addressed the white associate he had hired rather than the man signing the checks. He had built 300 buildings while being treated in room after room as a man who had wandered in by mistake. He had a phrase for it, one he had never said aloud to anyone, but one that had repeated to himself 10,000 times. They are not lying to me, he would think. They are misreading me. Those are very different things, and only one of them is mine to fix. Let me take you back further, just for a moment, because you cannot understand the man at the window without understanding the worst night of his life, and the worst night of his life involved a bar very much like this one. He was 26. He had just closed on his first full apartment block, a real building, 11 units, the largest thing he had ever attempted. He had gone, alone, to a hotel bar downtown to market, because there was no one left to market with. Ada was 8 years gone. He had ordered a drink and taken out a folder of papers to read the deed and the inspection report, and a man at the bar, drunk and loud, had asked him whether he was lost, whether he was waiting for someone, whether he knew this was not that kind of place. The bartender had said nothing. The bartender had simply not served him, had attended to everyone else, had let the silence do the work until Elias had folded his papers and walked out into the cold with the deed to a building he owned tucked under his arm, feeling like a thief in his own life. He had gone home that night and taken out the watch and sat at his kitchen table, and he had nearly believed them. That is the part he never told anyone. For one night, 26 years old, the most successful thing he had ever done, sitting in a folder on the table in front of him, Elias had nearly believed the men who looked at him and saw nothing. He had thought, maybe they see something true. Maybe I am exactly what they think. And then he had tapped the watch twice, the way Ada used to. And he had heard her voice as clearly as if she were standing behind his chair. The biggest mistake, she had told him once, is never being underestimated. It is starting to believe the people who underestimate you. He had put the watch back in his pocket. He had never come that close again. Close, he remembered though, standing at the window of the Meridian Room 25 years later, watch in hand. He remembered the cold and the folder and the thief feeling, and he understood that the boy who told him to stand had no idea he was reopening a door that had taken Elias decades to close. Back in the present, Priya had found the manager. The manager was a brisk woman named Helen Vance, who ran the floor of the Meridian Room with the precision of a surgeon and the warmth of a thermostat. Priya told her quietly that there was a situation at the bar, that a guest had been refused a seat, that she thought, she was not sure, but she thought it had not been handled well. Helen Vance was not a cruel woman, she was a careful one, which a place like the Meridian Room is sometimes the same thing wearing a better coat. Her first instinct was not justice. Her first instinct was containment. She came out onto the floor scanning for the size of the problem, rather than the shape of it. She saw a man in a plain coat standing alone at a window table, holding what looked like an old watch, causing no trouble at all. She felt the small relief of a manager who has been told there is a fire, and finds only a guest who looks, to her trained eye, unlikely to complain in any way that would reach the owner. She approached Conrad first, not the guest. She asked him what had happened. Conrad told her the man had wanted a bar seat and that he had explained the seating was for members. He said it with confidence because he believed it, because he had said versions of it 100 times, and it had always been allowed to stand. Helen Vance made a decision in that moment that she would replay for a long time afterward. She decided the cheaper path was to let it stand. She walked over to Elias, and she did not apologize, and she said, with the smooth regret of a woman declining a thing she has already decided to decline, that she was so sorry for any confusion, but that the bar was indeed reserved this evening, and that she would be glad to note his interest for a future visit. She offered him a card. She was in her own mind, being gracious. Elias looked at the card. He did not take it. He asked her one question, and he asked it without heat, almost gently, the way Ada used to ask him to explain a sentence he had skimmed. He asked her whether she knew who owned the Meridian Room. Helen Vance said of course she did. She said the owner's name with the small pride of an employee invoking a powerful patron. Mr. Reyes, she said, as if the name settled the matter, as if the name were a wall. Elias said very quietly that he was glad to hear the room was in good hands, and that he would wait a little longer, if she did not mind, and he turned back to the window. Helen Vance, unsettled in a way she could not name, walked back toward the host stand, and she did something she would also replay later. She told Priya, in a low voice, to keep an eye on him, in case he became a problem. Priya did keep an eye on him, though not in the way Helen meant. Priya had been watching Elias since he walked in, and she had seen something the others had trained themselves not to see. She had seen the cut of the coat, which was old but extraordinary. She had seen the watch, which a man does not hold like that unless it holds him back. She had seen most of all the stillness, the particular stillness of a person who is not waiting to be rescued, but waiting to see how far a thing will be allowed to go. Priya was 23. She was working the host stand to pay for night classes. She knew that stillness. She had grown up around men who carried it, her father chief among them, and she knew it was not the stillness of a man who did not belong. It was the stillness of a man who had decided, a long time ago, never again to beg a room to recognize him. She made a choice. It was a small choice, and it cost her, because she was the most junior person on that floor, and the manager had just told her to watch the man as a threat. She went back into the hallway, past the kitchen, to the small office where she knew the owner sometimes sat on slow evenings going over the books. She did not know if the owner was there that night. She knocked anyway. He was there. I want to be careful here, because the easy version of this story has the owner come storming out and put the bartender in his place, and that is not what happened. And the difference is the entire point. Thomas did not storm. When Priya told him hesitantly that a guest had been refused a seat at the bar, an older gentleman alone in a charcoal coat, holding an old brass watch, Thomas went very still himself, and the stillness that came over him was not anger. It was something closer to dread, because Thomas knew that coat, he knew that watch. He had seen it tapped twice across 31 years of second Sunday breakfasts. He had heard the story of the rail yard man who ran 4 minutes early his whole life. He knew, before Priya finished her sentence, exactly who was standing at the window of his bar, being treated like a man who had wandered in by mistake. He asked Priya one question. He asked her if the man had made a scene. Priya said no. He had simply asked for the manager and been refused, and gone to wait by the window. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. Of course he had. Of course Elias had not made a scene. Elias had never in his life made a scene. He had simply stood by a window and let a room show him exactly what it was, the way he had let rooms show him exactly what they were for 50 years. And he had not called the one man in the building who could have ended it in a sentence, because that was not who he was either. He would not use his friend to win an argument with a stranger. He would rather stand. Thomas stood up from the desk. He did not hurry. He walked out through the kitchen, past the line cooks who straightened when they saw him, and he came out onto the floor of the Meridian room. The first thing he did was not look at the bartender. The first thing he did was cross the entire length of that marble room to the small table by the window where his oldest friend stood holding a watch that ran 4 minutes slow. The room felt it before it understood it. That is how these moments work. The woman in the green dress looked up. The couple 2 stools down went quiet again. Conrad, behind the bar, registered the owner on the floor and felt the small reflexive pleasure of an employee about to be seen working hard, and he reached for a clean towel and stood a little straighter, entirely certain that whatever was happening had nothing to do with him. Thomas reached Elias. He stopped in front of him, and for a moment the 2 men just looked at each other, 51 and 51, 2 boys who had met over a book about compound interest 40 years before, and something passed between them that had no words and needed none. Then Thomas Reyes put his hand on Elias Brandt's shoulder, turned his body so the whole room could see, and said, loud enough to carry to the marble bar and past it, "This is the finest man I have ever known, and he is my best friend. And he has been my best friend for 31 years. The room went silent. I told you at the beginning that the owner crossed the floor and said 2 words that drained the colour from the bartender's face. Best friend. That was the 2 words. And you have now arrived at the moment I promised you, and I want you to stay, because what happened after those 2 words is the part that matters more than the words themselves. Conrad's face. Let me tell you about Conrad's face, because the watch on Elias's whole life had been built around the principle that the world is always later than it thinks, and Conrad had just discovered how late it was. The clean towel was still in his hands. He had been certain 30 seconds earlier that he was the most secure person in that room. Now the owner of the Meridian room had his hand on the shoulder of the man Conrad had told to stand, and was calling that man the finest he had ever known. And Conrad's mind was doing the terrible arithmetic that arrogance always has to do eventually, which is the subtraction of everything it assumed from everything that turned out to be true. He went pale, not theatrically. The blood simply left his face the way water leaves a glass when it tips, and he set the towel down on the bar very slowly, because his hands had stopped being reliable, and he understood, in the way you understand a thing all at once, instead of in pieces, that he had not refused a seat to a stranger. He had refused a seat to the soul of the room he stood in. Thomas did not look at him yet. This is important. Thomas did not turn to the bartender and unleash the scene the room was bracing for. He kept his hand on his friend's shoulder, and he asked Elias, quietly but not so quietly that the room could not hear what had happened. And Elias, who had absorbed 100 such evenings without complaint, did not exaggerate and did not soften. He said simply that he had asked for a seat at the bar, and that he had been told the seats were reserved, and that he had asked for the manager and been told she was busy, and that the manager had come and offered him a card. He named no one. He did not say Conrad's name, though he had it. He did not point. He simply laid the facts down on the marble, one after another, the way his grandmother had taught him to lay down a true thing, without decoration, and let it stand on its own weight. Every fact landed in the silent room like a stone into still water. Helen Vance had come back onto the floor. She heard the last of it. She watched her own choice replay in front of her, the card she had offered, the future visit she had so graciously promised. And she understood that the problem she had walked out to contain had not been the man at the window. The problem had been her decision that the cheaper path was to let the refusal stand. She had been a careful woman, and her care had been aimed at the wrong thing. She had protected the room from a complaint, instead of protecting a guest from a cruelty, and now the owner was standing in the middle of his own floor, with his hand on the shoulder of the man she had handed a card to, and asked to leave. Thomas finally turned. He looked at the bar, at Conrad standing pale behind it, at Helen Vance frozen near the host stand. And here is where the story refuses to give you the easy thing, because Thomas did not raise his voice. He had built the Meridian Room from a dish pit. He knew exactly how power moved through a room, and he knew that the loudest man in a room is rarely the one who has actually changed anything. He spoke quietly, and the quiet was worse than shouting, because the room had to hold its breath to hear it. He said that the Meridian Room had a single rule that mattered more than any other, and that the rule was that every person who walked through the front door was to be treated as though they were the most important person ever. Enter it, because you never, he said. You never know who is standing in front of you. He said it looking at Conrad. He said the rest of the rule, the part he had carried since the dish pit, the part Elias had taught him without ever meaning to 40 years ago, across a library table. He said, the moment you decide you can tell who matters by looking at them is the moment you have stopped being good at this work, and you have stopped being good at being a person. Then he did the thing that mattered. He did not fire Conrad on the floor. Understand the discipline in that. A public execution would have given the room a thrill, and given Conrad a story in which he was the victim of a powerful man's temper. Thomas gave him neither. He told Conrad evenly to go to the office and wait, and Conrad went, past the line cooks who did not look at him, through the door he had never once imagined himself walking through in shame, and the marble bar stood empty behind him, all 4 stools, finally and truly reserved for no one. Now let me tell you what Elias did, because this is the part the room did not expect, and the part I most want you to carry away. Elias did not gloat. He did not take the open seat at the bar with the air of a man reclaiming territory. He thanked his friend quietly, and then he did something that told the whole room who he actually was. He asked Thomas to bring Priya over. Priya came, uncertain, still half expecting to be reprimanded for going around her manager. Elias looked at her, this 23-year-old working a host stand to pay for night classes, and he said that she was the only person in the room that night who had looked at him and actually seen him, and that this was a rarer skill than anything taught in any school, and that he would like to know what she was studying. She said urban planning. She said it quietly, half embarrassed, the way you say a dream you are not sure you are allowed to have. Something moved in Elias's face. Urban planning. The architecture underneath a society that decides who gets a seat and who is told to stand. The exact thing a librarian with ink-stained cuffs had handed across a table to an 11-year-old boy 40 years before. He did not say any of that. He simply took out a plain card, the only thing he carried that bore his name, and he wrote a phone number on the back. And he told Priya that his foundation funded scholarships and, more than that, employed people who could see what others trained themselves not to see, and that when she finished her degree, if she still wanted to build cities that did not tell people to stand, she should call the number and there would be a place. Priya took the card. She read the name on the front, the Ada Brandt Foundation. She did not yet know who Ada was. She would learn. She read the name and she looked up at the man she had refused to stop watching, and she understood that the stillness she had recognized in him was the stillness of someone who had spent his whole life the being boy nobody handed a card to, and who had decided somewhere along the way to become the man who handed them out. Now the aftermath, because the stone matters less than the ripple, and the ripple of that Thursday night spread for a long time. Conrad was not fired that night. He was fired the following Tuesday, after a conversation in which Thomas did not yell at him once. Thomas told him that he was not being let go because he had refused a seat to the owner's friend. He was being let go because he had refused a seat to a stranger, and would have done it again and again, to every plain coat that walked through the door, and that the only reason anyone had noticed this time was an accident of friendship that should never have been required. The cruelty had been routine, the friendship had been the exception. And a room that requires an accident of friendship to treat a person decently is a broken room, and Thomas would not run a broken room. Conrad left without a story in which he was the victim. He left with the truth which was heavier and which he would carry for a long time. Helen Vance was not fired. She kept her job, and she kept it on one condition, which Thomas named and she accepted. The condition was that she spend one shift a month, indefinitely, working the host stand at the front door, greeting every single person who walked in, because she had forgotten what the door was for, and a person who has forgotten what the door is for must be sent back to stand at it until they remember. She did remember. Within a year, she was the reason the Meridian Room had a reputation among the people who paid attention to such things as the one elite room in the city where a plain coat was treated exactly like a fine one. Priya finished her degree 2 years later. She called the number on the card. There was a place exactly as he had said. She works now in the part of Elias's foundation that decides which neighborhoods get libraries, and she has a particular fierceness about the 3-bus neighborhoods, the ones everyone else has written off as worthless. And when she explains to a room full of skeptical men why a mispriced neighborhood is not a worthless one, she sounds, though she has never heard the recording, exactly like a boy who once slid a book across a library table and said you should read this part twice. And Elias took the open seat at the marble bar that night, finally, after his friend had gone to deal with the staff. He sat alone for a few minutes in the quiet room, and he ordered one drink, and when it came, he did not drink it right away. He took out the brass watch and set it on the marble in front of him, dented back, scratched crystal, 4 minutes slow. He looked at the time it told, which was wrong, which had always been wrong, which had been the most reliable thing in his life, precisely because it was wrong in a way he understood. The world is always later than it thinks. He had arrived early to everything for 42 years, and the room had told him every time that he had come too late, that the seats were taken, that he had wandered in by mistake, and every time the room had been wrong about the hour, because the hour was always later than the room believed, and the man it could not seize had always been there first. He tapped the watch twice, the way she had taught him. Then he raised the glass, quietly, to a woman who had taught herself to read from a seed catalogue and a Bible and the backs of medicine bottles, who had pressed a slow watch into a boy's palm and told him to be early, and who had been gone for 33 years and had never once, not for a single day, left the room. Let me tell you the thing this story is actually about, now that you have stayed long enough to hold it. It is not about a bartender being humiliated. The bartender's pale face is not the point, and if that is the only thing you take from this, you have taken the smallest thing in the room. It is about the difference between being lied to and being misread, and about how much of a life can be spent inside that difference. Elias was never in any of those rooms being deceived. The loan officers and the lawyers and the drunk men and the bartenders were not lying to him. They were misreading him, and those are very different things, because a lie is something done to you, and a misreading is something done with you, something that only finishes if you agree to be read that way. Elias never agreed. That is the whole of it. He stood at 100 bars and was told to stand, and he never once mistook the room's reading of him for the truth of him, because a woman with a fury about knowledge that she never raised her voice to express had taught him, before he was 9 years old, that a mind is the one piece of property the world cannot repossess, and that the only way to lose it is to hand it over to the people who tell you it was never yours. So here is the question I want to leave you holding, and I want you to sit with it the way Elias sat with that watch. Somewhere in your life there is a room that has read you wrong. A room that looked at the coat and missed the mind, looked at the title and missed the person, told you in a glance that cost it nothing to stand. You cannot always change what the room sees. You can decide, though, the way a boy at a kitchen table decided, never to believe the people who underestimate you, and never to become one of them when the room finally turns, and it is your hand on someone else's shoulder, your card in someone else's palm. Your turn to be the person who looks at a plain coat and actually sees. Be early. The world is always later than it thinks, and the seat was always yours.